That ancient rusted wire you call a fence is an illegal encroachment on association property, Mr. Henderson. According to our bylaws and the plat map filed with the county, you are currently trespassing. I have a crew scheduled for Friday morning to remove it and install proper community standard fencing along the correct boundary line. You will, of course, be billed for the removal, the new installation, and a series of escalating fines for every day the violation continues, starting retroactively from 30 days ago. The voice belonged to Karen, the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, a woman built like a bulldog and possessing a similar level of charm, who stood on my lawn breathing heavily as if the very act of speaking was a strenuous exercise. She held a clipboard like a scepter, a thick, more plus-size woman of about 55, whose floral print muumuu seemed to be actively losing a battle against her sheer mass. Her eyes, small and hard, scanned the 10 acres of rolling Tennessee hillside that had been in my family for 3 generations, and I could see the gears of avarice and control turning behind them. She wasn't just looking at my land. She was mentally annexing it, drawing new lines with her gaze, imagining it subdivided, sanitized, and subject to her petty regulations. The wire fence in question was more a suggestion than a barrier, a line of rusted barbs sagging between weathered cedar posts my grandfather had sunk into the earth 70 years ago, long before Whispering Pines was anything more than a patch of kudzu and pine trees. It marked the edge of our world and the beginning of theirs, and until this very moment, it had never been a problem. But now Karen was declaring it an illegal encroachment, and in her world, her declaration was law. The bill she was proposing would be thousands of dollars, a financial gut punch designed to force compliance through shock and awe. This was it, the moment the Cold War with the new subdivision next door went hot. If you're watching this, I know you've probably had your own brush with a power-tripping busybody who thinks a 3-ring binder and a title make them a feudal lord. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because you're going to want to see how this ends. And down in the comments, let me know where you're watching from, and tell me your own HOA nightmare story. I want to hear them all, because what Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly comprehend as she stood there radiating smug superiority, was that she wasn't dealing with just any landowner. She was dealing with a retired Army Corps of Engineers Sergeant Major, a man who had spent 25 years of his life drawing lines in the sand, both figuratively and with the most precise surveying equipment the military could provide. She thought she was weaponizing bureaucracy. I was about to show her what it meant to be a master of it. My name is Jack Henderson, and this is the story of how one overreaching HOA president tried to steal a piece of my family's legacy, and how a single, high-precision GPS survey cost her and her entire association a whole lot more than they ever bargained for. My grandfather bought this land after World War II with the money he'd saved while working in the Oak Ridge facilities. He wasn't a scientist, he was a machinist, a man who understood tolerances and precision, a value he passed down to my father, and my father passed down to me. He and my grandmother built the old farmhouse with their own hands, raised my dad here, and worked the land until the day they died. It wasn't just dirt and trees to us. It was a living testament to a life of hard work, a sanctuary from the noise of the outside world. When my wife Sarah and I retired, moving back here wasn't a choice, it was an inevitability. We updated the house, planted a massive garden, and settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, not by committee meetings and bylaws. The peace was shattered about 3 years ago when a developer bought the 200 acres of woodland adjacent to our eastern boundary and slapped up Whispering Pines, a subdivision of cookie-cutter beige houses packed so tightly together you could probably pass a cup of sugar from one bathroom window to the next. The sales brochure promised harmonious country living, but what they delivered was a suburban beachhead, an invading force of minivans, manicured lawns, and an endless list of rules governing everything from the color of your mailbox to the breed of your dog. From the beginning, I knew they would be trouble. Their construction crews had been careless, knocking down a section of that old fence and leaving piles of debris that I had to clean up myself. I'd lodged polite complaints, which were summarily ignored. Then came the letters. Gentle at first, friendly reminders about maintaining the visual harmony of the community, even though I wasn't in their community. They complained about my rooster crowing, the sight of my restored 1968 John Deere tractor parked near the barn, and the unapproved agricultural activities, which is what they called Sarah's vegetable garden. Each letter was signed by Karen, President, Whispering Pines HOA Board of Directors. Each one went into a folder and then into a wood stove. I figured if I ignored them, they'd eventually get the hint. I was wrong. Karen's visit was a declaration of war. She wasn't just complaining about aesthetics anymore. She was making a land grab. The Friday morning crew Karen had threatened arrived not in a work truck, but in the form of a single or smirking man in a polo shirt with the HOA's Whispering Pines logo embroidered over the pocket. He didn't have tools, just another envelope, which he tried to hand me over the very fence line that was the subject of the dispute. I met him at the property line, my German shepherd, Duke, sitting calmly but attentively at my side. The man who looked to be in his late 20s and radiated the kind of misplaced confidence that comes from having a petty authority figure backing you up, eyed the dog nervously. "Mr. Henderson," he chirped, holding the envelope out, "this is your final notice regarding the fence encroachment. President Miller asked me to deliver it personally." President Miller. So Karen had a last name. I made a mental note. I didn't take the envelope. "You can leave it in the mailbox," I said, my voice flat. "My property. My rules." He hesitated, clearly instructed to ensure I received it directly. "She said I had to give it to you." I just stared at him. Duke shifted his weight, the muscles in his shoulders bunching, and let out a low, almost inaudible growl. The man's eyes darted from me to the dog and back again. He took a hesitant step back, his bravado evaporating like morning mist. "Okay, mailbox it is," he stammered, scurrying over to the road and hastily stuffing the envelope inside before practically jogging back to his Prius parked 100 yards away, well clear of my driveway. I waited until he drove off before retrieving the letter. Inside, the language had escalated significantly. It was no longer a notice. It was a demand letter, drafted on what looked like cheap law firm letterhead. It cited specific, though vaguely worded, Haiti County codes and HOA bylaws. It formally declared the fence an unauthorized structure on HOA common ground and repeated the threat of forced removal, billing, and now a daily fine of $150, along with a special assessment of $2,500 for legal consultation fees. To cap it off, there was a threat to place a lien on my property if the fees went unpaid. This was her next move. Paperwork as intimidation. She was betting I was just some old country bumpkin who'd be terrified by official-looking documents and the threat of lawyers. It was time to start my own paper trail. I took the letter, a digital camera, and a GPS-enabled tablet, and walked the entire length of the disputed fence line, approximately 800 feet. I photographed every post, every strand of wire, and every inch of the ground on both sides. I took photos of the new houses in Whispering Pines, their manicured lawns ending abruptly a good 10 to 15 feet before they reached the fence line. A strip of unmowed, weed-choked land lay between their perfect grass and my grandfather's old wire. If this was their precious common ground, they took terrible care of it. After documenting the physical evidence, I drove into town. Not to a lawyer's office, not yet. My first stop was the county records office, a dusty basement repository of every deed. Plat and survey filed in the county for the last 150 years. I'd been here before when settling my parents' estate, and I knew the head clerk, a wonderful woman named Martha, who had a memory like a steel trap and a deep-seated distrust of developers. I explained the situation, and she pursed her lips, nodding slowly. "Whispering Pines," she said, the name tasting like something sour in her mouth. "We've had more boundary complaints and title search issues with that one subdivision than all the others in the last decade combined. The developer rushed the platting process. I told them then their survey looked sloppy." She led me to a massive leather-bound book of deeds from 1946. We found the entry for my grandfather's purchase. The legal description was old-fashioned, using metes and bounds, describing the property's boundary not with GPS coordinates, but with references to physical landmarks. Thence north, 89 degrees, 15 minutes west for a distance of 812.5 feet to an iron pin set at the base of a tri-trunked white oak. My heart beat a little faster. An iron pin. a physical, buried piece of steel that, if I could find it, one would be legally irrefutable proof of the original corner. The description was my grandfather's legacy, a map drawn in the language of the land itself. Next, we pulled the developer's plat map for Whispering Pines, filed just 4 years ago. It was a clean, modern, computer-generated drawing, and when I laid it next to a copy of my deed's description, the discrepancy was immediately obvious. Their map showed a perfectly straight north-south line. My deed described a line with a slight but significant dogleg. Their survey had simply ignored the original boundary and drawn a new one that was more convenient for them, shaving off a long, triangular slice of my property that was narrow at one end and widened to nearly 20 feet at the other. Karen wasn't just trying to move a fence, she was trying to formalize a theft of nearly a quarter of an acre of land. Martha gave me a knowing look. "Find that iron pin, Jack," she said quietly. "Find that pin, and you'll have them dead to rights." The gauntlet had been thrown down, not by Karen's blustering threats, but by the quiet authority of a 70-year-old deed. The fight wasn't just about my land anymore. It was about my grandfather's pin. Armed with copies of my deed and the developer's plat map, I returned home feeling a surge of cold, methodical anger. Karen had made this personal, but I was going to keep it professional. The first step was to find that iron pin. The deed mentioned it was at the base of a tri-trunked white oak. The problem was, the corner of the property where the pin should be was now a dense thicket of overgrown brush and young pine trees that had sprung up in the last few decades. The original giant oak was long gone, probably a victim of lightning or old age. Finding a single steel rod, likely buried under inches of soil and leaf litter, in a quarter acre of tangled woods felt like a monumental task. But in the Corps of Engineers, we had a saying, "The difficult we do immediately. The impossible takes a little longer." I spent the next 2 days in that thicket. I started by using the deed's description to triangulate a probable search area. I paced off the distances from other, more easily identifiable points on my property line. I bought a high-powered metal detector, the kind treasure hunters use, and began a systematic grid search, was sweeping the detector head low over the ground, inch by painstaking inch. The work was grueling. The heat was oppressive, the insects were a constant torment, and the metal detector screamed every few feet, alerting me to old cans, discarded nails, and pieces of forgotten farm equipment. Each false positive was a small jab of frustration. On the afternoon of the second day, covered in sweat, dirt, and a dozen scratches from thorny vines, I was about to give up and call in a professional. I was in the very heart of the search area, a spot where 3 old oak stumps, now rotten and covered in moss, formed a rough triangle. It was possible they were the remains of the original tri-trunk tree. I made one last, sweeping pass with the detector. It gave a loud, clear, and solid beep. Not the warbling screech of a piece of surface junk, but a pure, sustained tone that indicated a significant metallic object buried deep. I dropped to my knees and began to dig with a small hand trowel. I went down 6 inches, then 8, through topsoil and roots. My fingers hit something hard, round, and unyielding. It wasn't a rock. I carefully scraped the dirt away, my heart pounding in my chest. And there it was, a 2-inch diameter iron rod, its top mushroomed slightly from where a surveyor's sledgehammer had driven it into the earth 70 years ago. It was pitted and rusted, but it was solid, immovable, and exactly where my grandfather's deed said it would be. I sat back on my heels, the trowel falling from my hand, and just looked at it. A wave of emotion washed over me, relief, vindication, and a profound connection to the man who had hammered this pin into the ground. Why, this wasn't just a boundary marker, it was a legacy. It was proof. I took out my phone and documented everything. I took photos of the pin from every angle, with a ruler next to it for scale. I took a video slowly panning from the pin to the surrounding woods, showing its location relative to the old stumps. Then I used a handheld GPS unit to mark its exact coordinates. I carefully reburied the pin, covering it with a flat stone to make it easier to find again, and then camouflaged the area so it looked undisturbed. No need to let the opposition know I'd found my ace in the hole just yet. That evening, I drafted my first official response to Karen. I didn't use cheap law firm letterhead. I used my own personal stationery, which had a simple embossed John T. Henderson, SGM, USA, ready at the top. The letter was polite, formal, and utterly uncompromising. Dear Ms. Miller, it began, I am in receipt of your correspondence dated date. Please be advised that the fence you refer to is, and has been for over 70 years, located entirely on my private property, a fact substantiated by the original deed filed with the county in 1946. Your claim of encroachment is factually incorrect and without legal merit. Your plat map appears to be in error. Furthermore, any attempt by you or any agent of the Whispering Pines HOA to enter my property or to remove, damage, or alter my fence will be considered an act of criminal trespass and vandalism. The authorities will be notified immediately. All fines, fees, and special assessments you have mentioned are hereby rejected. Do not contact me again regarding this matter. All future communication should be directed to my legal counsel, whose information will be provided to you should you choose to pursue this baseless claim any further. I didn't have legal counsel yet, but she didn't need to know that. It was a bluff, but a calculated one. I sent the letter via certified mail, requiring her signature. The paper trail was now a two-way street. A few days later, I got my signed receipt back from the post office. The ball was in her court. I expected another threatening letter, perhaps from a real lawyer this time. What I got was far more brazen. The following Saturday morning, I was woken not by my rooster, but by the sound of a diesel engine and the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a post hole digger. I threw on my boots and ran outside. There, on the other side of my fence, was a commercial fencing crew, not just removing the old wire as threatened, but actively digging holes and setting new steel posts. And they were doing it a full 15 feet inside my property line, right where my GPS had told me the line should be based on the pin. And standing there, directing the operation with a triumphant smirk, was Karen, clipboard in hand. The sight of them on my land, tearing up the earth my grandfather had tilled, sent a surge of white-hot rage through me, the kind I hadn't felt since my days in combat. But my training kicked in, smothering the fire with ice-cold discipline. Anger was a luxury I couldn't afford. Strategy was a necessity. I didn't shout. I didn't run out there waving my arms. I walked calmly back into the house, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. I'd like to report a trespass in progress and the destruction of private property, I said, my voice steady. I gave the dispatcher my address and a brief, factual description of the situation. There is a woman and a work crew on my land, actively installing a fence without my permission. Then I grabbed my video camera. When the sheriff's deputy, a young man named Miller, no relation to Karen, I hoped, arrived, the scene was exactly as I described. The crew had already set 4 steel posts in concrete deep inside my property. Karen was in the middle of berating a worker for not aligning a post correctly when the deputy's cruiser pulled up, lights flashing. Her face, already flushed with exertion and self-importance, turned a mottled shade of crimson when she saw him. She immediately marched over to the deputy, clipboard at the ready, clearly intending to take charge of the situation. "Thank goodness you're here, officer," she began in a loud, saccharine voice. "This man," she said, pointing a plump finger at me as I stood on my porch, filming everything, "has been illegally encroaching on HOA property, and we are simply rectifying the boundary line according to our official plat map." Deputy Miller, to his credit, looked unimpressed. He was a local boy, and I could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew my family's name, if not me personally. He tipped his hat to me politely before turning his attention back to Karen. "Ma'am, I received a call about a trespass. Is this your property?" "Well, no, it's his," she admitted, gesturing vaguely at my house. "But this," she stamped her foot on the ground where a new post was set, "is the Whispering Pines common area. It's on our map. Do you have permission from Mr. Henderson to be on his property to access this area?" the deputy asked, his voice patient but firm. Karen sputtered. "We don't need his permission. We sent him notices. He is the one in violation." I chose that moment to walk down from the porch, still filming. I stopped at a respectful distance. "Deputy," I said, "this woman and her crew have crossed a clearly marked 70-year-old fence line. They are on my land, destroying my property and installing a structure against my explicit, written warnings. I have the deed to this land right here. I held up a folder containing the copies from the county clerk's office. I also have a letter I sent her via certified mail, which she signed for, ordering her not to trespass. The deputy's eyes narrowed. He looked from me to Karen, then at the new posts are set in fresh concrete. He was no surveyor, but he could see the old rusted fence line a few yards away, and he could see where they were working. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, his tone shifting from patient to authoritative, "I'm going to have to ask you and your crew to pack up your equipment and leave the premises immediately." Karen's jaw dropped. "You can't be serious. We are within our rights." "This is a civil dispute, ma'am," the deputy explained, his hand resting casually on his belt. "It's a disagreement over a property line. What's not a civil dispute is trespass and property damage. Right now, you are on Mr. Henderson's side of the old fence, and he wants you gone, so you're going to leave. You can sort out the boundary in court. You cannot sort it out with a post hole digger on a Saturday morning." The fencing crew, who had been watching the exchange with growing unease, needed no further encouragement. They were hourly workers, and this was clearly not worth the hassle. They started packing up their tools. Karen, however, was incandescent with fury. "This is an outrage. I am the president of the Whispering Pines HOA. I will be calling your supervisor. I will be calling the county commissioner." The deputy just sighed. "You do that, ma'am. But right now, you need to get off this property." Defeated and humiliated, Karen watched as her crew loaded up their truck. She shot me a look of pure venom, her eyes promising retribution. "This isn't over, Henderson," she snarled. "When our lawyers are done with you, well, you'll be begging to give us this land." Then she stomped off, following the truck as it retreated back into the beige labyrinth of her subdivision. After they were gone, Deputy Miller took my official statement. I showed him the holes, the fresh concrete, the discarded bags of cement mix. I gave him a copy of my video. "You should probably get a lawyer, Mr. Henderson," he advised. "She seems like the type who won't quit." "I'm way ahead of you, Deputy," I replied. I now had a documented case of trespassing and property damage. Karen's arrogant overreach had handed me the perfect weapon. It was time to stop bluffing and hire my counsel, and I knew just who to call. I had a friend from my Army days, Marcus Thorne, who had gone on to become a bulldog of a lawyer specializing in real estate and contract law. He ran a small, boutique firm in Nashville with a reputation for taking on tough cases and, more importantly, for winning them. His firm's unofficial motto was, "We don't just fight, we annihilate." He was exactly the kind of ally I needed. My call to Marcus was short and to the point. I laid out the facts. The family land, the new HOA, the boundary dispute, the iron pin, and Karen's disastrous Saturday morning invasion. I could almost hear the grin forming on his face over the phone. "Oh, Jack, my friend," he said, his voice a low rumble of amusement. "You didn't just call a lawyer. You called a connoisseur. This isn't a case. It's a vintage. An arrogant HOA president, a flawed plat map, and a documented trespass. It's got notes of hubris with a long, satisfying finish of financial comeuppance." He agreed to take the case on the spot. "Don't do anything else," he instructed. "Don't talk to her. Don't talk to her lawyers if they call. Don't even look in the direction of Whispering Pines. You are now a black hole of communication. Everything, and I mean everything, goes through me. And Jack, get a professional survey, not just a boundary marking. I want a full-blown, bells and whistles, GPS satellite-linked, sub-centimeter accuracy survey of your entire property line adjacent to that subdivision. I want a report so precise and legally airtight that the Pope would certify it. Spare no expense. We're going to bury them in data." Following his advice, I contacted the most reputable land surveying firm in the state, a company known for their work on major government and commercial projects. I explained the situation and what I needed. The lead surveyor, a man named Mr. Ott Davies, was intrigued. When I mentioned the 1946 deed in the iron pin, his eyes lit up. Like a master chef being asked to cook with the finest ingredients, he was excited by the challenge and the historical element. The survey was scheduled for the following week. It was an impressive operation. Two men, Davies and his assistant, arrived with a truck full of what looked like science fiction equipment. They set up a GPS base station on a tripod in the middle of my pasture, a device that communicated with a network of satellites to establish a fixed, hyper-accurate point of reference. From there, they used a robotic total station and a GPS rover, a device on a long pole with a receiver on top, to map every detail of the boundary. Davies was thrilled when I showed him the location of the iron pin. He and his assistant carefully excavated it. I cleaned it and took their readings. "Well, I'll be," Davies said, looking at the data on his controller. "This pin is a work of art. For the tools they had back then, the original surveyor was a master. He was off by less than an inch over 800 feet from the modern GPS projection. It's legally perfect." They spent the entire day working their way along the boundary, taking hundreds of data points. They located the corners, mapped the exact line of my grandfather's fence, and, most importantly, mapped the improvements the HOA had made. The 4 new fence posts set in concrete on my land. At the end of the day, Davies promised a full report, including a new certified plat map of my property within 10 business days. Meanwhile, Marcus was busy on the legal front. He sent a blistering letter to Karen and the Whispering Pines HOA Board of Directors. It was a masterpiece of legal threat and intimidation. It formally put them on notice for the criminal trespass and property damage, citing the sheriff's report number. It informed them that all of Karen's previous letters, fines, and demands were legally null and void and constituted harassment. It demanded they preserve all records, emails, and meeting minutes related to the dispute, warning them that any destruction of evidence would be met with severe sanctions. And it concluded with a tantalizingly vague statement. "We have retained experts to conduct a comprehensive analysis of the boundary in question. We are confident the results of this analysis will resolve this matter definitively. We will be in contact shortly to discuss the significant legal and financial liabilities you and the Whispering Pines HOA have incurred as a result of your reckless actions." The letter was designed to do 2 things: stop their attacks and make them sweat. It worked. The next 2 weeks were eerily quiet. The daily fine notices stopped. There were no more smirking minions leaving envelopes in my mailbox. A palpable sense of nervous silence emanated from the subdivision next door. They knew they had crossed a line, and now, thanks to Marcus, they knew the person they had crossed was fighting back with bigger guns than they had anticipated. During this time, I started doing some quiet research of my own into the residents of Whispering Pines. I wasn't looking for trouble. I was looking for allies. And I joined a few local community Facebook groups and simply listened. It didn't take long to find the cracks in Karen's empire. There were dozens of complaints about her tyrannical rule. People fined for their grass being a 1/4 inch too long, for having a basketball hoop that wasn't the approved shade of black, for planting flowers that weren't on the pre-approved list. One family was in a protracted battle over their son's disability ramp, which Karen deemed aesthetically displeasing. Another was being threatened with legal action over the color of their window blinds. Karen was an equal opportunity oppressor, and she had created a community of simmering resentment. I identified a few of the most vocal and articulate complainers, people who seemed to have a good grasp of the issues. I didn't reach out to them directly. That would be premature. Instead, I just filed their names away for future reference. The storm was coming, and I wanted to know who would be on my side when it finally broke. The day Mr. Davies's report arrived, it felt like Christmas morning. It was a thick, spiral-bound document filled with maps, data tables, and legal descriptions. It was beautiful. The centerpiece was a large foldable map showing the boundary line. There was the original deed line, marked in black, perfectly aligned with the iron pin I had found. There was the line of my old fence, marked in green, meandering slightly but always on my side of the black line. And then there was the line from the Whispering Pines plat map, marked in red. The red line cut a sharp, arrogant path across my land, just as I'd suspected. But the report contained a bombshell, something even I hadn't anticipated. In the course of verifying the boundary, Davies had written in the summary, we had to reference the original monumentation for the entire section. It appears the surveyor for the Whispering Pines development made a fundamental error in their initial point of beginning. They seem to have used a temporary construction benchmark instead of the official county-registered section corner monument, which is located 14.37 feet to the east. This error has been carried through their entire subdivision plat. The practical result is that the entire Whispering Pines subdivision is shifted 14.37 feet west of where its legal description says it should be. I read that paragraph 3 times. I got out a calculator. I walked out to my porch and looked over at the neat rows of houses. But Davies had not only proven that their boundary with me was wrong, but he had uncovered an error that affected every single lot in the entire subdivision. They didn't own the land they thought they owned. Their fences, their backyards, their sprinkler systems, a 14-foot wide strip of every single property backing onto my land wasn't theirs. And because the error was systemic, it threw every other property line within their subdivision into legal chaos. Karen hadn't just tried to steal a sliver of my land. In her blind arrogance, she had been presiding over a kingdom built on a foundation of sand, a house of cards resting on a catastrophic surveying error. And we now had the certified, legally unimpeachable proof. I called Marcus. "You're not going to believe this," I said. I could hear him tapping on his keyboard as I read Davies' summary aloud. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then he let out a low whistle. "Oh my God, Jack," he said, his voice no longer amused but filled with a kind of awestruck reverence for the scale of the disaster I was describing. "This is it. This is the silver bullet. This is the legal equivalent of a tactical nuclear strike. Karen Miller didn't just pick a fight, she just lost the war, the entire subdivision, and probably her house." He paused again, and then I heard him start to laugh. A deep, booming laugh that spoke of pure, unadulterated legal glee. "Get ready," he said. "We're about to go to the mattresses. It's time to schedule a meeting." Marcus's strategy was not to go nuclear immediately. "A bomb is most powerful before it explodes," he explained. "Ijuana, the threat, is the weapon. We don't sue them, not yet. We invite them to a mediation. We present our findings in a controlled environment and let the implications sink in. We let them self-destruct." He drafted a new letter, this one even more formal and ominous than the last. It was addressed to the entire Whispering Pines HOA Board of Directors, care of Karen Miller, President. It was also copied to the developer, who built the subdivision and the title insurance company that had underwritten all the home sales. This was Marcus's genius, expanding the battlefield. This was no longer just about me and Karen. It was about developers, insurers, and banks. The letter was a masterpiece of understatement. It had stated that our investigation into the minor boundary discrepancy was complete and that our findings had revealed certain significant material facts and potential title defects affecting not just my property, but the entirety of the Whispering Pines subdivision. It graciously invited the entire board to a meeting at his office to review these findings with the goal of reaching an amicable resolution and avoiding protracted and costly litigation for all parties. He gave them a date 2 weeks out. The inclusion of the developer and the title company was a strategic masterstroke. An HOA board might be foolish enough to ignore a threat from a single landowner, but a multi-million-dollar developer and a massive insurance corporation? Their lawyers would be on the phone with Karen before the ink on her signature receipt was dry. If we were forcing the adults into the room, the 2 weeks leading up to the meeting were a tense waiting game. I focused on my garden, on repairing the damage to my lawn where the fencing crew had dug, and on spending time with Sarah. But the impending confrontation was a constant, low hum in the back of my mind. I had faith in Marcus, in the survey, and in the truth. But I knew that people like Karen didn't surrender gracefully. They fought, they lied, they clawed, even when faced with undeniable facts. On the day of the meeting, I put on my best suit, the one I saved for weddings and funerals. It felt like a uniform, armor for the battle ahead. I met Marcus at his office an hour early. The conference room was intimidating by design. A massive mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, dominated the space. On one side were 2 chairs, for me and Marcus. On the other side, 6 chairs were arranged, waiting for the HOA board. At the head of the table, a large screen was mounted on the wall, ready for our presentation. On the table in front of our chairs, Marcus had laid out 2 thick, immaculately organized binders with my name on the spine. They contained the survey, the deeds, the photos, the sheriff's report, every piece of evidence we had. They were props, but powerful ones. The HOA board arrived exactly on time, not as a unified group, but trickling in one by one, looking nervous and uncertain. There were four of them besides Karen, two men in ill-fitting suits who looked like mid-level managers, and a woman who looked terrified to be there. Karen came in last, a walking thundercloud of indignation. She had dressed for war in a navy blue pantsuit that strained at the seams, her clipboard conspicuously absent. She refused to make eye contact with me, instead directing a look of withering contempt at Marcus. "Let's get this over with, Mr. Thorne," she said, taking the center seat. "We have a busy schedule." "Of course, Miss Miller," Marcus said, his voice smooth as silk. "We appreciate you all taking the time. My client, Mr. Henderson, and I are confident we can resolve this matter efficiently today." Marcus began by giving a calm, professional overview of the situation, starting with my family's long ownership of the property and the history of the boundary. He spoke with the dry precision of a history professor, lulling them into a false sense of security. Then he put the first slide up on the screen. It was a high-resolution scan of my 1946 deed. He read the meets and bounds description aloud, his voice giving the old-fashioned language a sense of gravity and power. Next, he showed a slide with photos of the rusted iron pin. "This, ladies and gentlemen, is the original, legally recorded survey monument for the northwestern corner of Mr. Henderson's property. It has been in the ground, undisturbed, for over 70 years. He then switched to the Whispering Pines plat map, the one Karen had been waving around as her gospel. He pointed out the straight line they had drawn. Then came the main event. He put our new certified GPS survey map on the screen. It was color-coded and easy to understand. My property was shaded green. The Whispering Pines lots were shaded beige. The area of encroachment, the slice of my land they had tried to claim, was a stark, angry red. "As you can see," Marcus said, using a laser pointer to trace the lines, "the official boundary, as confirmed by a state-licensed surveyor, using the most advanced GPS technology and anchored by the original, legally controlling monument, is here." The laser pointer rested on the line defined by the iron pin. "Your HOA's fence, and indeed your entire basis for this dispute, is based on this red line, which is in error. The land in question has always belonged and continues to belong to Mr. Henderson." There was a stunned silence in the room. The two men on the board were pale. Karen, however, looked merely annoyed, not defeated. "A map," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "You have a map? We have a map. Our map is the one filed with the county for our subdivision. It's the official record." "Ah," Marcus said, a predatory glint in his eye. "I'm so glad you brought that up, because your map is precisely what we need to discuss next. You see, in the course of our research, we discovered something unusual." This was the moment. The air in the room grew thick. I leaned forward slightly in my chair. Marcus clicked to the next slide. It was a complex diagram showing a satellite view of the subdivision, overlaid with two different colored grids. One grid, in blue, showed the lots as they were laid out on the ground: their houses, their fences, their driveways. The other grid, in yellow, was shifted slightly to the east. "What you are looking at," Marcus explained, his voice dropping to a somber, serious tone, "where is the difference between where you think your properties are and where they legally are? Your developer's surveyor made a catastrophic error. He started the entire survey for Whispering Pines from the wrong point. He used the laser to circle a spot on the map. The official section corner is here. Your surveyor started from a temporary marker over here." He moved the laser dot. "The result is a systemic error, a westward shift of 14.37 feet across the entire subdivision." He let that sink in. The board members were now staring at the screen, their mouths slightly agape. They were finally beginning to understand. "What does that mean?" one of the men asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It means," Marcus said, turning to face them directly, "that the westernmost 14 feet of every single one of your backyards along Mr. Henderson's property line isn't yours, it's his. It also means that every property line inside your subdivision is now legally questionable. The fence between you and your neighbor? It's probably in the wrong place. The deck you just built? It might be encroaching on your neighbor's lot or on the HOA common area. The very house you are living in might not be fully situated on the parcel of land described in your deed. He paused, letting the full weight of the catastrophe settle on them. It means, he concluded, his voice like the Grim Reaper's knock, that none of you have clear title to your property, and your HOA president's aggressive actions against my client are what brought this unfortunate fact to light. The silence that followed was absolute. Karen's face had gone from red to a pasty, chalky white. The foundation of her world had just been liquefied, and she was sinking fast. The immediate aftermath of Marcus's revelation was chaos. The two men on the board began speaking at once, their voices a frantic babble of, "How is this possible? And what does this mean for our mortgages?" The other woman looked like she was about to be physically ill. Karen, however, remained unnervingly still, her face a mask of disbelief. She looked at Marcus, then at me, as if trying to find a flaw in the trap that had just snapped shut around her. "This is a trick," she finally said, her voice thin and reedy. "A lie. You're trying to extort us." Marcus simply smiled a cold, reptilian smile. "Ms. Miller, this is not a trick. It is a certified survey from one of the most respected firms in the state. We have the data. We have the monumentation. We have the math. What we have is the truth. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" He leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, the picture of calm confidence. "Let me lay out your options for you, since your leadership has brought you to this precipice. Option A, you can call me a liar. You can hire your own surveyor who will inevitably find the exact same thing we did, costing your HOA tens of thousands of dollars only to confirm your own doom. Then we will file a suit for quiet title for the 14-foot strip of land along the boundary. We will win. We will also sue you, the board, personally for damages, harassment, and legal fees. The court will likely order a full resurvey of the entire subdivision at the HOA's expense. Your title insurance will be invalidated. Your mortgages will be called into question. Property values in Whispering Pines will plummet overnight. It will be a legal and financial bloodbath, and it will be entirely your fault." He paused, letting the horror of that scenario permeate the room. The board members looked at Karen, their expressions shifting from confusion to dawning fury. "Or," Marcus continued, his voice softening slightly, "there is option B. You can accept the facts as presented. You can work with us. Mr. Henderson is a reasonable man. He has no desire to own a 14-foot wide strip of 60 different backyards. He doesn't want to cause financial ruin for his neighbors. All he ever wanted was to be left alone on the land his family has owned for 3 generations." He slid one of the thick binders across the polished table. It landed in front of Karen with a heavy, definitive thud. "This is our settlement proposal. It's quite simple. First, the Whispering Pines HOA will pay for the recording of a new, legally binding boundary line agreement and plat map based on our survey, correcting the border between Mr. Henderson's property and your own. This will cede the land you attempted to claim back to him permanently. Second, the HOA will pay, in full, for all of Mr. Henderson's legal and surveying costs to date. The total is itemized on the first page. It is not negotiable." The board members flinched at the number, but no one spoke. "Third," Marcus went on, "the HOA will issue a formal, written apology to Mr. Henderson for the harassment and trespass. Fourth, the HOA will pay to have the 4 fence posts your crew illegally installed on his property professionally removed, on when the land restored to its original condition. And fifth, and this is the most important part, the current HOA Board of Directors will resign. All of you, effective immediately. You will facilitate the process for a special election to form a new board." A collective gasp went through the room. This was the masterstroke. It wasn't just about land or money. It was about removing the rot. "You can't do that," Karen shrieked, finding her voice at last. "You have no right." "Oh, but we do," Marcus said calmly. "We have the right of leverage. Your actions have exposed this entire community to catastrophic liability. The only way for the residents of Whispering Pines to mitigate their damages, to have any hope of negotiating with their title insurers and mortgage lenders to fix this colossal mess, is to demonstrate that the irresponsible and incompetent leadership that caused the problem has been removed. A new board, a board that isn't tainted by this debacle, will have a fighting chance. You, he said, pointing his pen directly at Karen, do not. If you stay, you sink the whole ship. Our offer is contingent on a full regime change. The other board members were no longer looking at Karen with anger. They were looking at her like she was a disease. They were seeing her not as a leader, but as the author of their ruin. One of the men, a Mr. Albright, cleared his throat. "Let me see that proposal," he said, his voice shaky but resolved. He reached across Karen and pulled the binder towards him. He opened it and began to read. The other two board members huddled behind him, reading over his shoulder. Karen was left isolated, Udiyut alone in the center of the table, her power evaporating in real time. She had built her kingdom on the enforcement of rules, and now she was being undone by the ultimate rule, the unchangeable, irrefutable geometry of the land itself. She looked at me then, for the first time, with raw, naked hatred in her eyes. It was the look of a tyrant who has just realized the peasants have stormed the castle and the guillotine is being wheeled into place. I met her gaze and gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a nod of triumph, but of finality. The war was over. All that was left was signing the surrender. The board meeting, of course, was the stuff of legend in Whispering Pines. Marcus and I weren't there, but the story came back to me in pieces from my new network of community allies. So the emergency meeting was held in the subdivision's clubhouse, and it was standing room only. The air was thick with anger, fear, and betrayal. The moment the proposal to accept our settlement, including the mass resignation of the board, was put to a vote by the terrified, now former board members, Karen tried one last, desperate power play. She stood up and declared the meeting out of order, claiming it was an illegal coup. She tried to use the arcane language of bylaws and procedure that had been her weapon for so long, but it was useless. The magic was gone. The residents, now armed with the knowledge of how her actions had jeopardized their single biggest investment, shouted her down. They didn't care about Robert's Rules of Order. They cared about their property titles. The vote to accept the settlement was nearly unanimous. The vote of no confidence in Karen and her board was absolute. According to my sources, she was unceremoniously stripped of her title, her binder of rules, and her clubhouse key right then and there. A public humiliation that was a far more fitting punishment than any court could have devised. A temporary board was established, comprised of some of the very residents Karen had terrorized the most, including the family with the disability ramp. Their first official act was to sign our settlement agreement. The following week, a cashier's check for the full amount of my legal and surveying fees arrived at Marcus's office via courier. It was a beautiful, five-figure sum that represented the price of arrogance. The same fencing company that had trespassed on my land was sent back, this time with a work order signed by the new HOA board, in order to remove their posts. I watched from my porch as the same crew, looking deeply chagrined, broke up the concrete and carefully filled the holes, their foreman offering me a mumbled but seemingly sincere apology. A few days later, a formal letter of apology arrived in my mailbox, printed on the HOA's letterhead, but signed by the new board president, a woman I recognized from my Facebook research as one of Karen's most eloquent critics. It was concise, professional, and devoid of the passive-aggressive tone that had defined all of Karen's communications. The transfer of power was complete, but the real work was just beginning for the residents of Whispering Pines. The 14.37-foot error was a cancer in their community's legal DNA. The new board, to their credit, tackled it head-on. They hired their own legal counsel and a new surveyor, notably not the one who made the original error, to work with the title insurance company. The solution was a complex and expensive process of filing a replat of the entire subdivision with the county, a process that required every single homeowner to sign off on corrected deeds and boundary agreements. It was a nightmare of paperwork and legal fees, a penance for the developers' sloppiness and Karen's hubris, paid for by the homeowners themselves through a series of steep special assessments. My small part in this drama was to sign a quitclaim deed. In it, I formally gave up any claim to the 14-foot strips of land that the survey had shown were technically mine in exchange for the new, legally recorded boundary line we had agreed upon. It was a formality, but a necessary one to allow them to clean up their titles. I didn't ask for a single dollar for that land. I had already won. My victory wasn't about gaining territory. It was about defending what was mine and achieving justice. The new board president came to my house personally to get my signature on the final documents. We sat on my porch, drinking iced tea, with Duke lying at my feet. She was a reasonable, intelligent woman who was exhausted but determined to fix the mess she had inherited. "You know," she said, looking out over my fields, "in a strange way, you saved us." Karen was running this place into the ground. Everyone was miserable, but no one knew what to do. You stood up to her, and the whole rotten structure came down. It's a mess now, but at least we have a chance to rebuild it right. We talked for over an hour, not as adversaries, but as neighbors. I learned about her kids. She learned about my time in the Army. By the time she left, we had forged a tentative peace, a new understanding based on mutual respect. The war was officially over. A few weeks later, I hired a contractor of my own. I had them tear out the last remnants of my grandfather's old rusted wire fence, and in its place, right on the GPS perfect, legally recorded, and now mutually agreed upon boundary line, we built a new fence. It wasn't a cheap community standard fence. It was a beautiful 4-board oak fence, the kind you see on horse farms in Kentucky. It was strong, elegant, and permanent. It was a statement. As the last section went up, a few of my neighbors from Whispering Pines, the ones whose backyards met my property, came out to watch. They didn't look angry or resentful. They looked relieved. One of them, a man named Tom, whose kid's swing set was on a patch of land that could have been mine, walked up to the new fence. "That's a fine-looking fence, Jack," he said. "A good fence makes good neighbors," I replied, quoting the old saying. He nodded, looking at the solid oak boards that now separated our worlds. "You know, we were all terrified of Karen," he admitted quietly. "But we were also scared of you, the mysterious old farmer on the hill. Turns out we were scared of the wrong person." He stuck his hand over the top board. "I'm Tom. It's good to finally meet you, neighbor." I shook his hand. It was a firm, honest handshake. The boundary was secure. The battle was won. But in that moment, shaking hands over the fence that had caused so much conflict, and I realized I had gained something more valuable than just a secure property line. I had gained peace, and I had helped a whole community find theirs too, by showing them that sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to draw a line in the sand, or in my case in the dirt with a 70-year-old iron pin, and refuse to back down. Karen, I later heard, sold her house at a significant loss and moved away. The weight of the special assessments and the public shame were too much for her. She disappeared, another petty tyrant consigned to the dustbin of history, her reign of terror undone by a single, immovable point of truth buried in the Tennessee soil. The months that followed were a period of quiet restoration, both for my property and for the community next door. With the legal battles concluded, the real work of neighborliness began. The new oak fence, which had started as a symbol of my victory, slowly transformed into something else entirely, a meeting point. Tom, the man I'd shaken hands with on the day the fence was completed, made it a habit to chat with me over the railing while he was doing yard work. We talked about everything and nothing: the weather, the deer eating his wife's azaleas, the best way to deal with Japanese beetles. He had a son who was considering joining the military, and he asked me endless questions about my service. Listening with a respect and curiosity I found disarming. Through Tom, I met other families. They were, for the most part, decent people who had simply been caught in the web of a poorly managed HOA and a developer's greed. And they had bought into the dream of harmonious country living and had instead found themselves in a suburban police state run by Karen. My fight had inadvertently become their liberation. The new HOA board, led by the woman who'd shared iced tea on my porch, made good on their promise to reform. They went through the bylaws with a fine-tooth comb, gutting the most restrictive and nonsensical rules. The approved color palette for mailboxes was abolished. The strict regulations on garden plants were replaced with general guidelines about neatness. The family with the disability ramp was not only allowed to keep it, but the HOA offered to help pay for a more permanent and aesthetically pleasing version as a gesture of goodwill. They were learning to govern with common sense rather than with an iron fist. One Saturday, when Tom invited Sarah and me to a community barbecue in the Whispering Pines clubhouse, the same room where Karen's empire had crumbled. We were hesitant at first, feeling like outsiders, but Tom insisted. "You're the guest of honor," he'd said with a laugh. "You're the guy who shot the dragon." Walking into that clubhouse was a surreal experience. The space was filled with the sounds of laughter and children playing, a stark contrast to the tomb-like silence of the mediation or the simmering rage of the emergency board meeting. People I didn't know came up to shake my hand, to thank me. They didn't thank me for the 14 feet of land, which was still a sore subject for their wallets, but for something more fundamental. One woman, whose name I didn't catch, put it best. "You held up a mirror," she said. "We were so busy worrying about the color of our own shutters that we didn't see the monster we were creating. You reminded us what's actually important." The most surprising encounter of the day was with Mr. Albright, one of the former board members who had been in the room during Marcus's presentation. He approached me by the grill, a plate of potato salad in his hand, looking humbled and a decade older. "Mr. Henderson," he began, his voice low, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, we were fools. We let her run roughshod over us for years. We were so intimidated by her, so afraid of making waves that we went along with things we knew were wrong. Your lawyer was right. We were incompetent. When she came to us with her plan to reclaim that land from you, we should have stopped her. We didn't. And I'll have to live with that." It was a genuine, heartfelt apology from a man who had lost faith in money, and it meant more to me than the check that had paid my legal fees. "The past is the past," I said, extending my hand. "All that matters is what you do now." We shook, and in that moment, the last vestiges of my anger toward the old board melted away. They weren't evil, just weak. They were a cautionary tale about the dangers of abdicating personal responsibility to an authority figure. As Sarah and I drove home that evening, the back of my truck laden with leftover brisket and a blueberry pie from Tom's wife, I felt a sense of closure that went beyond simple vindication. We had fought a war and won, but now we were helping to build the peace. The financial cost to the residents of Whispering Pines was steep. The replatting process, the legal fees, and the special assessments took a couple of years to fully resolve. Property values dipped for a while, as the news of the title cloud spooked potential buyers. But in the long run, the community became stronger for it. The shared crisis forged bonds between neighbors who had previously only communicated through passive-aggressive notes left on windshields. They had faced the abyss together, and it had changed them. My lawyer, Marcus, became a minor celebrity in Nashville legal circles. The story of the Whispering Pines debacle was a perfect case study in property law, a tale of hubris and high-tech surveying he told with great relish at legal seminars. He'd sent me a ridiculously expensive bottle of single malt scotch as a thank you, with a note that read, "To the best client a lawyer could ask for, may all your future battles be as righteous and as profitable." I kept the new certified plat map, the one born from the GPS survey, framed in my office. It hung next to a sepia-toned photograph of my grandfather standing in front of the half-finished farmhouse, his face etched with the pride of a man building something that would last. The two images, one a product of modern technology and the other of old-fashioned grit, told the same story. A story about the importance of knowing where you stand, of defending your ground, and of the enduring power of a line drawn in the earth and in the law. The land was safe, the legacy secure. The peace my family had sought on that Tennessee hillside was once again ours, deeper and more appreciated than ever before. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The new fence weathered from a bright oak to a distinguished silver gray, blending into the landscape as if it had always been there. The boundary it represented was no longer a line of conflict, but one of quiet coexistence. The residents of Whispering Pines, having navigated their collective legal nightmare, had become fiercely protective of their new, accurately surveyed property rights and their reformed HOA. The new board operated with a transparency and humility that was the polar opposite of Karen's reign. Meetings were collaborative, decisions were debated openly, and the primary goal was the genuine well-being of the community, not the blind enforcement of arbitrary rules. I became an unlikely informal consultant. Occasionally, the new board president would call me with a question. It's not about bylaws, but about the land itself. Jack, we've got a drainage issue on the common area behind Lot 42, near that old creek bed. You've been here forever. Does that creek ever flood badly? My historical knowledge of the property, once a private family record, became a shared community resource. I helped them identify areas prone to erosion, pointed out where old springs emerged in wet weather, and shared my grandfather's wisdom about the local soil and trees. In return, they shared their community with me. We were invited to their 4th of July parade, a small affair of decorated golf carts and kids on bicycles. They bought Sarah's excess tomatoes and zucchini at a small farm stand we set up at the end of our driveway. On their buy local enthusiasm, a far cry from the old complaints about unapproved agricultural activities. One day, a young couple who had just moved into Whispering Pines stopped by. They had heard the legends, of course. "So, you're the Mr. Henderson," the young man said with a grin. They had a question about putting in a vegetable garden in their backyard and wanted my advice. They were worried about breaking the rules. "The only rule that matters," I told them, "is to plant what you love to eat, and maybe put up a small fence to keep the rabbits out." I sent them home with a box of heirloom tomato seedlings and a renewed sense of possibility. The ghost of Karen was well and truly exorcised. The most tangible symbol of the new era came about 2 years after the Great Survey debacle. The developer who had built Whispering Pines, having been dragged into the legal mess and forced to contribute to the settlement with the title insurance company, decided to offload the last remaining parcel of undeveloped land adjacent to the subdivision. It was a 50-acre tract of woods and hills directly bordering my southern property line. The moment the for sale sign went up, a fresh wave of anxiety swept through Whispering Pines. They feared another developer, another 100 beige boxes packed in tight, more strain on their resources and the potential for new boundary disputes. The HOA board called a special meeting, not to fight, but to strategize. They invited me to attend. In the familiar clubhouse, they laid out the situation. They had approached the developer about buying the parcel to be preserved as a community green space, a park, but the asking price was far too high for the HOA to afford. "We're stuck, Jack," the president said. "We don't want the development, but we don't have the capital to stop it." I looked at the map they had projected on the screen. I knew that 50-acre parcel like the back of my hand. It was where I learned to hunt with my father. It contained a beautiful spring-fed pond where I'd taken Sarah on one of our first dates. The thought of it being bulldozed for another cul-de-sac made me feel physically ill. For 2 generations, my family had been content with our 10 acres. We had defended it, but we hadn't sought to expand it. But looking at the worried faces in that room, my former adversaries who were now my neighbors, an idea began to form. It was audacious, it was expensive, and it was the perfect final chapter to the story. When after the meeting I went home and had a long talk with Sarah, we walked through our finances, we talked about our legacy, about what we wanted to leave behind. The next morning I called my lawyer, Marcus. "Marcus," I said, "I need you to draw up an offer. I'm buying the woods." The negotiation was swift. The developer, eager to wash his hands of the entire area and its history of legal trouble, was surprisingly receptive to a clean, all-cash offer from a private individual. He probably figured I was a simpler transaction than a homeowners association. Within 2 months, I was the proud owner of an additional 50 acres of Tennessee woodland. The land was safe, but I wasn't done. I called the HOA president. "I have a proposal for you," I said. We met not in a lawyer's office, but on a trail overlooking the pond on my newly acquired land. I laid out my plan. I would place the entire 50-acre parcel into a conservation easement, legally preventing it from ever being developed. Then I would grant the Whispering Pines HOA a formal perpetual license to access the property for recreational use. They could create and maintain hiking trails, use the pond for fishing, and have picnics. Their children would have a safe place to explore the woods. They would get their green space, their park, their buffer from the outside world. In return, they would pay a nominal annual fee of $1, and their residents would form a trail committee to help with the upkeep, clearing brush, and ensuring the area was respected. She was speechless. "But why?" she finally asked. "You could have just kept it for yourself." "Well, you could have charged us a fortune. Because this land was never meant to be covered in houses," I said, looking out at the water. "And because my grandfather taught me that being a landowner isn't just about ownership, it's about stewardship. And sometimes good stewardship means sharing." The agreement was ratified at the next HOA meeting to a standing ovation. The animosity that had once defined the relationship between my farm and the subdivision next door was officially replaced by a partnership. The fence was still there, the property lines were still clear and respected, but the invisible walls had come down. My final victory wasn't in a courtroom or a surveyor's map. It was in the sound of children laughing as they skipped stones across the pond my father had taught me to fish in, and in the quiet nod of thanks from a neighbor met on a wooded trail that we now shared. The land was at peace, and so were its people.